For all of these things, we need to have a pretty good understanding of how props work and how we pass data from one component to another, which is via props, right? Who's allowed to screw around with state, all that good stuff. So we already, before the end of class yesterday, moved our notes up to the state of the app component, right? This.state.notes within app. We're passing that down as a prop to main, which passes them on to the list. We want to make it so that clicking them in the list makes them show up in the form. And those two components don't know anything about each other, and they don't need to. Right? Who made this work? Loading data in the form when you click the note in the list. Adding a note to the list when you do something with the form. Delete button. Yeah. Make the plus button in the sidebar clear out the form. So, Lily, you did the loading the note that? Yes. Yeah. Loading into the form when you click the thing.
Yeah, it bugs out when I try to do the second one.
Okay. Yeah, what'd you do?
I set a state that was like the current note, and then...
Okay, just hold that thought for just a second. So, the list of notes comes from the list of notes on state, right? So the form needs to get its data from state somehow, right? It has to know which note. So it kind of makes sense to also store in state which one you're working on right now. That's the one that's in the form, right? So continue.
Yeah, I passed down current note to form.
Okay.
And then made it so that when I clicked the note, it changed the value of the current note.
Okay. So we didn't worry about any of the other components at first when we made note list work. Note list and note. We made them work just given any list of notes. We made note, just plain note, work no matter what. Like first it was just a variable with a single note. And then without ever changing the note component, we made it so that it came from an array, then it came from an object, then it came from an object that happened to be passed down from state. Made no difference here. Note just needs the data to get passed in. And the note list just needs the list. Happens to be from state. So note form needs to get the data from somewhere. And as Lily suggested, it makes sense for that to also be on state, to just keep track of which one you're working on right now. So if you don't worry about how to get these two to talk to each other. Worry about how to get the view of this form to reflect the state of the data. The rest will follow. So let's start there. So on app, we have this.state.notes. Let's add another property to state. Current note. And just set that to something with an ID of null, title of empty string, and a body of empty string. Just set our initial state. And see if we can get that data down to the form. How do we pass data from one component to another? Props, right? And this current note needs to end up in note form. But there's something between here and note form, right? Main. So before main can make it to note form, it needs to, before the current note can make it to the form, it needs to go through main. So in main, we'll add another prop. I'll call it current note. And what do I set it to? Thank you, Mia. This.state.current node. Let's prove that that much worked. What I'm trying to say is, let's find an excuse to use the React Dev Tools. So in your Dev Tools, hopefully you installed this weeks ago, you should have a React tab. It may be all the way at the end or something. If so, go ahead and drag it to be right next to the console, because we're going to use it a lot. If we flip over there, you'll see your components. Not just the DOM, but your actual components, complete with state and props. Really helpful for troubleshooting. So we can see on app, we have state, current note, and notes. On main, we now have both things too, as props this time. Props notes, props current note. So that worked. Also notice this. On the Elements tab, when we're inspecting an element, remember how it set the current element to $0 so we can mess with it in the console? $R. I highlight the app component, and in the console tab, $R is app. Really handy for, say, testing out a method that you want to make sure works. Double checking the value of different things. Super handy. We're going to use the heck out of that. So now we've confirmed that the current note prop did make it to main. So from main, we need to pass it on to note form. Current note equals what? Props.current note. Because at this point, it's not state anymore, right? It was state within app. But in main, current note came in as one of the props. In note form, though, we have a class. So the whole component isn't a function, so the props don't just show up as an argument to the function. How do we get to current note from inside note form? Say it again. This.props.current note. So we want that to be reflected in the actual form fields. So what'd you do, Lily? What'd you do to get them to actually show up?
In the input and the text area, the value is this.props.currentNode.title.
So for title here, this.props.currentNote.title. And on the text area, same thing, but it is current note.body. Now in HTML, to set the value of a text area, you actually don't set a value attribute. It would be the content in between the opening and closing tags. But if you want React to control the text area, then you use a value prop, just like you do on an input. So these are controlled form inputs, meaning that React is controlling their value, not the DOM directly. There's another way to do it using an uncontrolled component. We prefer not to do that because we want React to manage our state. But should you ever see the word ref starting to pop up, that's a clue that that's the thing you might want to look up in the documentation, uncontrolled forms or uncontrolled inputs. But we're doing it the controlled way. This.props.currentNode.title. We don't have any errors, so that probably worked. So the form is getting its data, we think, from the current node. But we can check that out real quick. What if in app.js, and I'm just doing this temporarily, you don't necessarily need to do this. What if I just set the initial state so that the title of current node is testing? Yeah, there it is. I get a warning, but that's okay. Yeah, so the form is now getting its value from app state current node. So then to complete this piece of the homework, so that clicking this makes it show up in the form, what does clicking this really need to do? I just manually set current node in this.state to have a title. And that's where this gets it, so it did it. What did I just said? Oh, yeah. So if we want clicking on this to update the form, what do we really want clicking this to do? Yeah, we want it to set the current node. It doesn't need to know a darn thing about the form, and the form doesn't need to know a darn thing about it. We've already established that the form displays whatever the current node happens to be. Just like the list shows whatever the current lists happen to be. So clicking this just needs to set the current node. The fact that that then updates a form is kind of beside the point. So the current node is on the app component's state. So which component or components are allowed to mess with it? Just app, right? It's the only thing that can set its own state. So let's add a method to do that thing. By the way, I don't know if it's been mentioned yet. Keep the render method as the last one. It's not going to break if you don't, but everyone's going to look for it there. So put it there. So let's call this set current node. So it should probably take a note as its argument. And how do we do it? We do not just say this.state.current node equals note, right? What do we do instead? This.setState. And you give it the new state object. So we want to replace the key note with, or excuse me, current note, right? With this note that was passed in. Now, will doing this blow away this.state.notes because I only passed in current note? It will not. So it'll only change the keys that are present there. The ones that are not present in the argument to set state, it will just ignore and leave them alone. Does that work? I can test it without hooking it up to an event handler or anything in the console. Let's try it out. So my React Dev Tools, I make sure that app is highlighted so that I have this $R variable. Let's say const note is ID. We'll give it an ID. Yeah, some number. Title. Afternoon. Body. I less than 3 react. $R now is the app component. Set current note. Pass it this note. And what do we expect to happen when I do this? Yes. It works. So now we just have to make it so that clicking one of these calls that. So don't take this personally, John, but don't answer. How the heck do I do that? We have it so that right now, I think, clicking one of these goes clicky clicky down here. How do we make it so that it sets the current note when we click? Because only app is allowed to change that. We have a method for it, set current note. But we need to somehow call that method from down in note list, or really all the way down in note, right? Alex? So this .set current note works from inside app. But how do I make it so that clicking on this does it? Zach?
Pass it down as a prop in main, the function itself, and then call it whenever you need it down, all the way down.
Yeah. Pass the function itself as a prop. So we've used callbacks a lot already. We pass functions as arguments to other functions. So why couldn't we pass a function as a prop? We totally can. So to get it all the way down to note, it has to go through main, right? So we're passing in a prop for notes, one for current note, and we can pass in a prop for set current note. And set it to what? What do I type here? This dot set current note. Yep. So that'll take it to main. Main needs to pass it on to note list. Set current note equal, of course. Well, maybe you can tell me without looking. From inside main to pass it down to note list, my prop set current note will be set to what? Props dot set current note. Right. And then a note list. We need to pass it on to note, right? I'm going to flip the order of these. So set current note equal, again, props dot set current note. And then in note, what do I do? On click already calls handle click, which right now is just console logs. What if it called set current note instead? What do I type? Come on, more people know it than just 3 people, 4 people. I want to call set current note from inside here. Thank you, Ryan. Props dot set current note. And call it. Now, this wouldn't be any fun if this worked. The question is, how's it going to break? Oh, wait. Set current note. Set current note expects an argument, right? We need to pass the note in. So how do I pass the note in? So props.note here. It just expects the whole note as the argument, so props.note ought to do it. Okay. Now let's see. Prepare to click. Click. Explode. This.setState is not a function. We just tried this darn function from the console. It worked then. So if this.setState is not a function, what that says to me is that this probably isn't what I think it is. Are you raising your hand? Okay. What's up, Josh? It is not. So what is it, though? What is this? I wish. Let's do a console log this inside set current note. Just comment that out for now. Click. It's an object with note and set current note. What? And key. What is this? What the heck is this thing? So keep in mind, we didn't make set current note the actual event handler, right? Handle click is. Not that it necessarily matters in React. So what are the rules for how it gets bound? It's a method, right? Because we're calling it with the dot syntax. We're actually calling object dot method name parentheses. We're the ones calling it, and we're calling it that way. And we've been promised that when you call it that way, this gets set to the object that you called the method on. What object did we call that method on? Line 5. Props. Props dot set current note. It's not where the method was defined. It's the object you called it on. So this inside set current note is the props to the note component. Well, that doesn't do us much good. So, yep, we're going to have to fix that. So when you call a method this way, it's always the thing before the dot, which may or may not be where you originally defined it, because we started passing that method around as a callback and stuff. So what can we do about this? What can we do about this? We could bind it down here when we pass it as a prop. Bind this. Does that work? Yeah, it does. Feels good. Totally legit. Sometimes you need to do more than one thing with a bound function. Like you may have several places in the JSX that you're using it, and you want that binding there every time, and it's a pain to write it every time. So another thing we could do to achieve the same effect is bind it in the constructor when the component first loads. Say this dot set current note equals this dot set current note dot bind this. So bind actually returns a new function with that binding. So if we set that back to this.setCurrentNote, now every place we use this.setCurrentNote, that binding will be there. If we ever wanted it not to be, we would have to unbind it. But if you think there's an occasion when you won't want it, just do it a different way instead of in the constructor. Does that work? Did I break it? Nope, still works. And a third way. So this is a pretty darn new language feature. It's not part of ES6. It's not even part of ES 2017 that was released like 5 days ago. But it is a stage 2 proposal for ECMAScript. It will be in a future version, but it is at a stage in the process where there could be some minor changes before it's finalized. But the syntax will probably stay the same. But the fact that it's at that stage means browsers don't support it. But that's okay, because browsers don't support JSX either, but we're using that, right? Thanks to Create React App, we have this build system that's already in place using something called Webpack that takes our stuff and calls various other tools to run our code through it. One of those things is Babel. And Babel is the thing that turns, bleeding edge JavaScript into a certain target version of JavaScript. It could turn it all down to ES6. It could turn it all down to ES5. And it's pre-configured to do that in Create React App. And it's very configurable. You can tell it, just how bleeding edge you want to be. But it's pre-configured to support some pretty darn new stuff, including what I'm about to show you, which is property initializers. This is a post on the Babel website, and its examples happen to be built around React here. And here's the idea. Instead of, say, setting a property in the constructor saying this dot blah equals barf, you could just say inside the class blah equals barf. Terrible example. It means, heck, we could actually set state out there. We wouldn't have to do it in the constructor anymore. We could say state equals whatever right out here in the class. We're not going to do that just yet, but we could have done that. We can do that with methods too. Instead of using the regular method syntax, we could say method name equals an arrow function. Which is the same as setting this.setCurrentNote equal to that. And by using an arrow function, it binds this. That's one of the things that arrow functions do. That's how they differ from just using the bare function keyword. So that's called a property initializer inside a class. And it's just, it's what we do when we set an arrow function as a variable. We're just doing it as a class property. So if you create your methods this way in your classes, you basically don't have to worry about the binding of this. Is it all true? Does it still work? Yay. So even if it isn't clear why that works, if you can just get in the habit of writing this way, it'll save you some trouble. But hey, it works. It does what the homework said. Let's celebrate. Load a note in the form when it's clicked in the list. Homework part 1, go us.